Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 47 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister.
And myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisis.ie.
Mark, good to see you as always. And you will recall that last week in studio we had a wonderful interview with Michael O'Flaherty, head of the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, who talked about his fascinating work in the area of human rights and international relations. What wonderful work that man does.
Yeah, extraordinary. And his experience of working in former Yugoslavia during the conflict was just really interesting.
And for such a high-profile Irish person operating internationally, he's not as well known as you'd expect him to be.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, hopefully we've changed that a little bit. Okay, Mark, so as you know, we have previously focused on planning and development law on this podcast. And today we're going to focus in and zero in on a very important document called the Kenny Report, which was produced under the chairmanship of former Supreme Court Judge John Kenny. It was published in 1973, and it sought to regulate the price of building land in the public interest. Does this have a contemporary feel, I wonder? Well, we are delighted today. We're going to be joined by Tim Ryan, who is a legendary political correspondent and has done a load of other things. And he has written a book on this called The Kenny Report, Housing a Missed Opportunity, the Tangled Story of the Kenny Report. I know you've read the book and you were very impressed by it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, the Kenny Report is so mythical. And as Tim himself said, there have been letters to the Irish Times for many, many years saying, why has the Kenny Report recommendations never been implemented? And now we know.
But bizarrely, it seems very hard to get your hands on this.
Yeah.
There are only a few copies hidden away in dusty corners somewhere.
I'd say somewhere in the law library there will be a copy of the...
Somebody can find it for us. Okay, well, first we're going to go to some cases that you've identified from the Decisis website. Our first case was brought by a receiver seeking possession of property subject to a mortgage. The borrowers sought discovery of documentation in the usual way, but the receiver did not want to disclose a mortgage sale deed, didn't want to give that away at all, whereby the original mortgage had been sold by the original lender to another financial institution. This is the case of Ryan versus Purcell, a High Court decision of Mr. Justice Conor Dignam.
Yeah, so yeah, as you said, this is a claim for possession by a receiver. But I suppose the interesting thing about this, which was basically a discovery application, is the receiver had been appointed not by the original mortgagee, but by the financial institution that bought the mortgage from the original mortgagee. And so when the defendants were seeking to defend this claim for possession, they sought discovery in the usual way. But one of the things they weren't given was the mortgage sale deed between the original mortgagee and the other financial institution. And so they brought an application for further and better discovery of that document. And obviously the receiver said, they don't need this, we've established ownership. But the issue here was that there were certain provisions of other documents that referred back to the mortgage sale deed. And what Mr. Justice Dignam said was, you can't understand these other documents unless you have a copy of the mortgage sale deed. So for that reason, he granted them discovery of it.
Okay, but when I looked at this first, I thought, obviously they're going to get the mortgage sale deed. But you're saying that there were arguments that the receiver could make which would sort of, a legitimate objection to giving this?
Yeah, I think that once they were able to show that they were the registered mortgagee, they said that was all they needed to prove in order to get an order for possession. It's just that there were other documents that referred back to this mortgage sale deed.
Very interesting. Yeah. Okay, very good, very good. Okay, let's move on to case number 2. And this is a Court of Appeal decision. The Minister for Transport granted a contract for the Coast Guard Air Sea and Rescue Services and, to provide that service, I presume. However, an unsuccessful tenderer sought to challenge the contract by judicial review. This gave rise to an automatic suspension of the contract, and the state was very worried we're not going to have cover, we're not going to have air and sea rescue facilities as a result of this.
Yeah. So this is ultimately it's a public procurement case. So the contract for Air Sea Rescue Services was coming up for renewal in 2025. The Minister for Transport granted a new contract, and as very often happens, an unsuccessful bidder wanted to challenge it. They brought judicial review, but that meant that the contract was automatically suspended. Now, the concern from the state's point of view was that in order to set up this kind of helicopter service, there's a big lead in time, and if it was the suspension carried on for any length of time, that would mean that there was literally nobody to carry out air sea rescue. So the application before the court was to lift the automatic suspension, effectively to allow the contract to be granted. And what the court effectively said was, well, look, that may mean that the unsuccessful bidder doesn't later have a hope of succeeding, but they still have a remedy in damages against the state. But at least the state can be sure that there will be a helicopter service in place for Air Sea rescues.
Okay, and I should have said this is a Court of Appeal decision. This was CHC Ireland DAC against the Minister for Transport, and it was a decision of the Court of Appeal given by Ms. Justice Caroline Costello.
And affirming the decision of the High Court.
Of the High Court, yeah. Absolutely. And finally, to a competition law case involving an application for security for costs. The proceedings concerned a company operating a private hospital and the VHI. They were the two parties. It had already been the subject of a number of judgments concerning the expert economist who was retained by the plaintiff. Another expert evidence case, Mark. How do these keep creeping in all the time?
That.
Having succeeded in the Supreme Court, the defendant then sought security for costs against the applicant company. So this was the case of Sweeney versus the VHI, and it's the decision of Mr. Justice Max Barrett in the High Court.
Yeah, so this case has already been in the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court in relation to this expert evidence issue, where they had the applicant, the plaintiff, had retained Moore McDougall, who had a previous connection with the VHI. And ultimately, the Supreme Court said that Moore McDougall could not act as the expert witness for the plaintiff. So the case having gone all of that way, in May of this year, May 2023, the state wrote to the plaintiff company, which was running a private hospital, and said, we want you to provide security for costs. Because if you're a limited company, obviously there's a real danger that the defendants won't have their costs covered. It's very unusual for an application for security for costs to be entertained so many years after the case was first issued. And so that was, as far as I could see, the main defence of the plaintiff in the case.
And the sums of money in this were huge. 1.8 million.
Well, that's a curious thing about this, because it seems that the plaintiff never actually challenged the sum of money that VHI said it would cost them to defend these proceedings. I mean, it does seem extraordinary. This is a competition law case. Yes. And what they're saying is the VHI, in refusing to provide cover to this private hospital, is abusing its dominant position. But the VHI has said that it would cost nearly 1.8 million to defend these proceedings, which is a staggering amount of money. I mean, obviously, a barrister of your caliber,
yes.
is
I was going to say, nice work if you can get it.
Exactly, yeah. But anyway, it appears that Mr. Justice Barrett accepted that sum on its face because the plaintiff hadn't challenged the sum of money assessed by the VHI and granted the order.
Okay, superb, Mark. Really well explained. Thank you for those. And we're back shortly with Tim Ryan.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So we are delighted to be joined in the studio today by Tim Ryan, who is going to talk to us about the Kenny Report. But Tim Ryan has a very interesting background. He worked as a journalist for years in the Cork Examiner, as it then was, and then the Irish Press. And after the Irish Press folded in 1995, he went into public consultancy. He has also written a number of books, one on the Ballinspittle moving statue, 3 biographies of note, one of P.J. Mara, one on Dick Spring and one on Albert Reynolds. And he has also written 2 editions of Nealon's Guide, which I have to mention a conflict of interest, where I worked with him on the second one of those in the 2020 election. Nealon's Guide is the go-to place for political aficionados in the country. But he has now set up his own publishing company, Grand Canal Media, and I think this is the first book published which is called Housing: A Missed Opportunity, the Tangled Story of the Kenny Report. So, Tim, thanks very much for joining us on the Fifth Court.
Delighted to be here.
So maybe we just start by just asking you a little bit about your background in journalism before moving on to the Kenny Report. I mean, you've worked with everybody, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I suppose I started out life, I did a degree many years ago in UCC in English and Latin, and taught as a secondary school teacher for 3 or 4 years before moving into journalism. And I was freelance, like a lot of people do, started out in Tipperary for the local papers and doing bits and pieces for the national papers. And I think it was 1984, I worked for 6 months in the office of TJ Maher, who's then the well-known MEP in Munster. And after that finished, I was lucky enough to get a job in the then Cork Examiner, where I was for 2 or 3 years.
And that is an esteemed publication that another person present once worked for.
We have a special handshake, don't we, Tim? Because we were there. We were there, man. You know?
Was it the Irish Examiner by the time you joined us?
No, I joined it when it was the Cork Examiner, and I was there when it became the Examiner and then the Irish Examiner. So there was kind of a transition period of about 6 months, you know. But take us back to Academy Street all those years ago in Cork. Legendary place, full of characters and wonderful journalists.
Oh yeah, wonderful. It was a great training ground and a very nice place to work. And in many ways, I often regretted leaving it because there was a great camaraderie. And I made some great friends there, like T.P. O'Mahony, who
became a barrister. Well, he certainly did a law degree,
yeah. And Peter Tusky, you might remember, who went to RT later, went abroad. Tommy Barker was property editor there, or he became property editor,
and I think
he's still there.
Yes,
one of the people that I would still know if I walked into the newsroom in the Examiner. Most of them retired now. And of course, when I joined it in 1985, that was a very wet summer. And one day I remember Donald Musgrave, who was the news editor on the Examiner, asked me to go down to Ballinspittle. There were some reports about moving statues. Little did I know I'd spend the next 3 months camped out down in Ballinspittle reporting on.
And did you see any statues moving?
No, I didn't. I never saw anything moving. I couldn't believe how what I used to consider were normally sane people coming up to me, including I remember a Garda sergeant local. Couldn't believe how I couldn't see this moving one night. I mean.
Actually, we have to explain this in more detail for some of our newer listeners, our younger listeners who won't know about this. 1985, Ballinspittle, crowds came from all over Ireland on a regular basis to see a statue of the Virgin Mary up on a hill, and people claimed it was moving. Yeah,
a mother and I think a friend and two girls were out walking one night, and they had claimed they saw it moving, and they told people, and loads of people gathered, and it just expanded. It was unbelievable. I mean, I remember counting 10 and 15 buses down from Dublin alone some nights. Just to leave O'Connell Street and come down. Hard to believe it in 2023, but it did happen in 1980.
But there was a knock-on effect throughout the country, wasn't there? There were statues moving all over the country that summer, yes.
Various different countries.
That's why there was a psychologist in UCC Polish man called Dr. Jurek Kierakowski, and I met him somewhere talking about it, and he'd written a piece, I think, for the Examiner, and we decided there's a book in this. I'll just relate the facts, and you try and explain what's behind it. And I mean, he did. I mean, and it was hard to explain what's behind it, except that if on a wet night, if you keep staring at lights and behind a statue, eventually you'll think they're shaking or moving if you keep staring long enough. But some people seem to see all sorts of things. I could never see anything, but it took off, and the chip vans did very well, and they moved in, and the coffee shops, and
absolutely,
yeah.
And then so you left the Examiner and you moved to Berkey, the Irish Press.
Yeah, I went to
the celebrated Irish Press, which sadly is no longer with us since 1995. But tell us about your time in Berkey.
Yeah, I started off there as I got a job I come from a farming background in West Tipperary, so I've always had an interest in farming. So I got the job there as agricultural editor in 1987, and I did that for a couple of years. Again, joined a newsroom of wonderful people, great people that were there. And T.P. O'Mahony was actually still working with the Irish Press that time as religious affairs correspondent, and went back to the Examiner. But I was sitting across in the room, across the desk from me was the well-known financial writer, Colin Rappel.
Yes.
Who I established a good relationship with him. Colin was very well known in producing the budget, the tax book every year.
And Tim Pat Coogan was
editor. Tim Pat was editor at the time.
Yes.
Still with us, thank God.
And what about the Fianna Fáil slant in Berkey? I mean, we know it was set up by De Valera all those years ago. Yeah, Charlie Haughey was in power in those days.
Yeah.
So what about all of that?
It was there, but very much in the background. I mean, the guy who in politics, in the old days, they would just have reprinted what De Valera said word for word, more or less. The guy who probably broke the mould on the political reporting there was a guy called Michael Mills, who was the political editor.
Later ombudsman?
Later on became the first ever ombudsman. The only reason he took the job, I think, I remember him telling me himself, was he told the management, Mr. De Valera at the time, Vivian De Valera at the time, that the only way he would take the job was if he was free to report as he saw it. And he did. And he was quite critical of Fianna Fáil in some of his writing. So he was a very straight-down commentator. And of course, with some other political journalists, then they had the job afterwards. Sean O'Rourke was there for a while.
Yes,
Emily O'Reilly. So they were non-partisan. They just were professional political journalists. So I think, the Irish Press lost the Fianna Fáil tag at that stage. And certainly when I worked in Leinster House, you were free to report. And I have to say, nobody ever asked me to pull a story or to write it in a certain way. You were very free to do what you, as were all the journalists in the Irish Press. And the Sunday Press, of course, we had great political reporters and editors there, like Stephen Collins was there.
So who was editor? Michael Keane in those days?
Michael Keane was editor,
Yeah.
Andrew Shepherd, news editor. There was a very good team of people on the Sunday Press. I mean, it was It was a huge seller that
and
time.
great fun to work in the Irish press.
Great fun, yeah, great
I think
camaraderie.
of all the papers, it was the one everybody enjoyed. Maybe it's because you were situated beside Mulligan's pub.
Yeah.
That might have had some impact.
Yeah, in the evening time, especially on a Friday evening, everybody would just...
The great Con
out.
Houlihan and all the gang, you know?
Yeah, and it was a privilege to work with people like Con Houlihan, who was a gentleman. I mean, I was privileged to know Con, and often spoke to him and saw him standing in the hill or in an alley stand during matches with no notebook ever. But I remember meeting him in Mulligan's pub one evening after an All-Ireland with, I think it was between Tipperary and Antrim in 1989. And he said to me, I'm exhausted. And I said, why? And he said, I have to retain it all in my head. I don't take any notes. And
then he'd get up at 6 o'clock
Get
in the
up
morning.
at 6 o'clock in the morning.
And
write
he'd write
it.
this most beautiful prose, a sentence per page, wasn't that it?
Send a paragraph on each page.
Yeah,
and
then
it in.
hand it in, sheafs of paper, and somebody would put it
And
together.
only one or two typesetters could actually read his writing. And he'd go in, bring it in, out. This was the early morning pub, was the White Horse across the way. He'd go across to the White Horse, have his brandy and milk, and the typesetter would set it. And when he'd done, the copy boy would bring it across the road to Con, sitting at the bar, and Con would go through it meticulously with the pen and correct everything down to the last comma.
Wasn't it Con Houlihan who said, a man who can misplace an apostrophe is capable of anything?
You're exactly right, Mark. That's what he did say.
A lesson many in the legal profession have yet to learn.
Oh, yeah, and if it came out and he'd missed one, he would be frantic over it and making a small error. He was meticulous. Great grammarian, great writer. I mean, I'm sorry, I mean, one of the great regrets I have is I used to go in and when I was on the Irish Press news editor for a while, and I'd pick up all the pages that Con would have had that were left thrown around from the evening press column, and I said, if I kept one of them, I'd love to have it. But all of them I put in the bin. And
those columns used to sell the evening press, didn't they?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, obviously the wonderful journalism as well that went along with Con Houlihan, but it was such a huge seller. Okay, Mark, I'm hogging this talking about journalism. We better go on to the story du jour.
Yeah. So, Tim, you're here primarily to talk to us about the Kenny Report, and you've written this book, Housing a Missed Opportunity, which I had the good fortune to buy a copy of at the launch, and I've read it, and it's for a subject that people might think of as very dry. It is a very readable book. And dare I say, the introduction by Lorcan and Sarah alone shows what an important topic it is, and really how, in a way, it's quite an exciting topic. Could you tell us, first of all, what interested you in the Kenny Report? How did you decide to devote a book to this?
It was unusual, I mean, that I'd come across this, but I'd seen letters mainly in the Irish Times now and again referring to this Kenny Report and why it hadn't been implemented. All the time when I was covering politics in the Dáil, it all the time came up in Labour motions and bills, and notably from the Labour Party, proposed bills to implement the Kenny Report. But I'd never seen the Kenny Report. In fact, as Lorcan sort of points out in introduction, it's almost impossible to get a copy. And even
it's not available online, no?
No, I think there might be a PDF copy available online. I mean, the copy I have is a photocopy somebody gave me from the RT library, I think. Right. So it's not, most people that talk about it have never read it or never even seen it.
Sure. And how did the Kenny Report come about?
The Kenny Report came about because, a bit like today, and a bit like many times in the late 1960s, house prices start to shoot up. And it's particularly the price of land, development land. And the developers were already moving in, buying land, hoarding it, and flipping it and selling it on. And it was causing huge rise in the house of prices. So the minister at the time was Bobby Malloy, and he'd tried to look at all sorts of options.
I mean, this is the issue where you have a piece of agricultural land that's selling. I mean, these days it might sell for something like 10 to 12,000 an acre or something like that. As soon as the planner rezones it, suddenly it becomes maybe 6 or 8 sites, each of which might sell for 40, 50, 60, 70,000 per site. And so suddenly your acre worth 10,000 is worth several multiples of that. And that all goes into the hands of the landowner, who in many cases would be a land banker, somebody who's bought a load of land in the expectation that one day it will be rezoned. Isn't that's the issue?
That's the issue.
And so there's this massive windfall that falls into the hands of the property owner that might otherwise go to the state in some form or another.
In other words, there's no community benefit.
Yeah.
It's all into the pockets of the few. Mm-hmm. And what Judge Kenny was trying to do was to try to minimise that, and that the land, because you have a number of factors. You've labour costs, you've the materials, you've the levies, and you can kind of cost them reasonably easily. But the loose factor out there that you can't control is the price of land, because there's no control over it. It's market forces, and the fact that market forces should be allowed free for something that's as important as housing, I think is wrong. I think there should be some regulation that controls the price of land as a major factor if you're going to try and keep the price of houses down. And any of the, in the book, you'll see the planning regulator, you'll see the ESRI, you'll see the Nest people, all of them in the report say the one loose cannon out there that needs to be controlled to get house prices down is the price of land.
And this is something that Bobby Malloy was conscious of in 1973 when he commissioned the Kenny report, and Judge John Kenny took that ball and wrote the Kenny report. Can you just tell us a little bit about John Kenny? Because he's quite an interesting character, isn't he?
He's an interesting character, yeah. He was he lectured in law as well and part-time in UCD. Very individual mind. He would be regarded as, looking back, as probably one of the brightest High Court judges when he became a judge. And
but his own father was a building contractor.
His own father was a building contractor who went bust, I think, at least once, if not more. So he would have been quite familiar with the ups and downs of the property industry. And his father had helped build a lot of what's now Mount Merrion around that area of Dublin. So he was very familiar with building. And he had an interest in it. And I think that's why, and I commented on it, and that's why I think Bobby Malloy chose him to chair the report.
Yeah. So can I just come in there, Tim? So look, the period, the late 1960s, this was kind of post-Lemass. Jack Lynch took over in 66 and there had been a period of growth in Ireland, isn't that it?
That's right.
And I mean, people who remember more recent housing crisis, obviously currently one, they're set against periods of growth, economic growth. Ireland is wealthier, land prices go up. So Bobby Malloy put together this committee, and it was chaired obviously by John Kenny, who you've spoken about. So what was their remit? What were they set out to do? What did Bobby Malloy say? Come up with a set of proposals.
Proposals that would help to limit the price of land and give some community benefit, and also to suggest any changes in legislation that might be necessary to do this. And that's what. And they stuck to the brief.
There was a strong push for development of suburbia, wasn't there?
Well,
the periphery of towns, the periphery of cities, agricultural land. A little premium of maybe 25% on top of that, wasn't that it?
People make a lot of hay sometimes about the 25%. I mean, what Kenny said in the report was, when you're taking the land or buying the land from the farmer at agricultural value, plus you give them, he said, 25%, give or take. He wasn't hung up on the 25%. He wouldn't have objected to 30% or whatever. This was to account for disturbance, that the farmer had to go buy another field or to buy another farm or whatever. So he thought 25%. And I'm sure if in cases where it might be major disturbance, he wouldn't have had a problem with giving some more. That was a very kind of flexible figure. But people tend to hang on to it as, oh, that was too little or whatever. He just put it out there as a kind of a figure that he thought struck a balance between the interest of...
There are sort of compensation principles anyway in compulsory purchase. So, taking one person's field can cause a lot more disruption than taking another person's field, simply depending on how it relates to the house, how it relates to the rest of the farm. So, I mean, it's not an insurmountable obstacle, the 25%, is it?
No, if somebody has a big dairy farm and put a lot of money investment into it, and they're milking a lot of cows, and suddenly you split the land, take half it off. The farmer's left there, I mean, he has to buy more land. That's a different situation to someone who's just a few cattle walking around or whatever, and the land isn't so valuable in another part of the country. So there obviously would have had to be flexible. The 25% was not set in stone.
Okay. So it was published in 1973. Okay, and what was the reception? How was it received?
Well, just when it was published, the government changed actually very shortly after, I think within weeks. And
so Liam Cosgrave came in, Fine Gael Labour, yeah.
And we got a Labour minister, Jimmy Tully, better known maybe for other things later on.
Tullymander.
And initially, of course, they looked at it, and a cabinet meeting agreed to adopt it. So the government did accept it in principle. People forget that. But the point we should make here is that in the report, there was a minority report. And most unusually, there was a majority and minority report. And the minority report, most unusually, I don't think it's happened since, was written by the two civil servants from the commissioning department, which was now the Department of Housing, then Department of Environment. And those two civil servants opposed it. Basically, and there were a number of arguments, but the main argument was that it was unconstitutional. And the legal officer in the department at that time was utterly opposed to it. And the civil servants, and I've spoken to a few civil servants that were around at the time, and they said among the civil servants, there was no will to implement it for various reasons, but one was the unconstitutional. And they lobbied hard and with the government and told them this is... So, of course, the minister normally takes the advice of civil servants, so it was kind of put at the long figure. the other thing is...
there was political support across the board for this, wasn't there? I mean, there was Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour support, and they were basically the only three parties of significance at the time.
Fine Gael, I mean, who would expect to be against it, I mean, if they were representing large farmers or whatever. But in principle, they accepted it in the beginning, and a number of ministers like Peter Barry took an interest in it later on. Kind of, I would call, ministers with a kind of a strong social commitment, especially for housing, which is different to developing for maybe some commercial or something else. And the other thing that's forgotten is people who lived like myself through the 1970s, the Northern Trouble started. And I mean, a lot of it dominated, if you can remember the time, with the Dublin Monaghan bombings we had. Then we had an oil crisis and house prices came down. And the whole panic about houses took a back step.
And then the hunger strikes and the recession of the 80s and all of that.
And the whole thing went down.
I mean, I suppose sometimes you find that governments take the view you don't let a good crisis go to waste. And maybe the 80s might have been an opportunity to do that. But what struck me in the book was that one of the big promoters of the Kenny Report was Rory Quinn, who became Minister for Finance in the mid-90s. And he never pushed to implement it when he was actually in government, did he?
And I tried to find out and reason from him, but I didn't really get clear one. The only one I got was that it just got pushed down the agenda. Other things constantly were more important. And any time this was raised in the Dáil, and I've given some Dáil quotes from in the book, the old hairy chestnut of the Constitution came up. It went to the Attorney General, and I've quoted some of any Attorney Generals always, I think, err on the side of caution. I think that's the way they go. And most of them would have said the answer is, this is a matter that should be tested in the court. We can't know it is or isn't. And of course, the logical thing is they should have tested in the court, the same as we have.
Well, but it's actually in the report, isn't it, that because of the radical nature of the recommendations, that there should be an Article 26 reference almost sort of built into the
Judge Kenny recommended that it be the test report. And this was the Law Society used this as an objection, saying, well, if the judge thinks it isn't sure about it and it should be tested in the court, well, then there must be a major question mark about this. And the thing kept getting kicked.
Such a shame that it wasn't referred. I mean, that would have been, as you say, Supreme Court could have pronounced upon it, and then there was no more obstacles. Yeah. I'm curious when Mark says, and he refers to the fact that Rory Quinn came in as Minister for Finance in about 94, 95. Was the report still relevant then? We're talking like 25 years on at this stage.
Oh, it was.
Was it still a fresh, piece of thinking that could be applied to the Ireland of that day?
Yeah, I think the principles were still live, and I think the principles are still alive today. Okay. I mean, I quoted there, the opening paragraph in the book is about the Nest report in 2021, which is, of course, chaired by the Secretary-General of the Taoiseach's Department, Martin Fraser, who was there then, and the conclusion is the Kenny Report is still relevant today.
And I think the other thing to say is that in the meantime, we had a very long and very expensive tribunal into planning issues, which arose largely from the fact that people appeared to be prepared to take quite significant lengths to arrange for certain lands to be rezoned, to put it mildly. So, I mean, clearly the issue of rezoning lands and the windfall that went to developers or land bankers was a live issue in the 1990s. And I mean, certainly I remember the time of all of the, what they call them, Part 4 rezonings, when each local authority would effectively override their own planners' recommendations to rezone land. I mean, it was a very live issue in the
right through up into the 90s, and even today. I mean, one of the things that Judge Kenny opposed was, and he looked in the report at all sorts of taxes and putting tax on development land, vacant land like we have now, all that. And him sitting around today, he would oppose still the sort of proposal we have now for vacant land and land that's not developed, because we now have the ludicrous situation to have to put off the zoned land tax, because many people like farmers have land zoned that they don't know is zoned, and they want to de-zone it. So that legislation has been halted. So all that would have been obliterated and wouldn't have arisen if Kenny had been accepted.
Will you explain the concept of betterment? This was crucial to Judge Kenny's thinking, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. There's a lot of kind of confusion over what it means, but it was largely mean, and there was a report called the Utwat Report, which came from Britain, which Kenny was very much concerned with, about looking at what betterment means. It probably in simple terms means the increase in value that comes to land when you provide the facilities, the sewerage and the water, and that the increased value that gives to the land, which Kenny would argue should really go to the community, because the community are paying for the utilities. So the betterment value should really go in some way to the community. I think that's, or at least a good portion of it. And that's what he was trying to get across, as is specified in Article 43 too.
And the other thing that comes through in the book is that, which I hadn't realised about the Kenny report before, is that it's not such a market-driven concept. I mean, it's not a question of somebody buying land and then basically applying to the local authority to buy it and give them their 25%. The idea is that the government, through its own planning, identifies areas of zoning, buys the land itself, and then rezones it, and then either sells it onto a developer or develops it itself. And so you wouldn't have the same problem that you've had in certain parts, certainly of Dublin, where these huge housing estates would be built that didn't have schools, didn't have public transport links and all that kind of thing, because the whole thing would have been much more centrally planned.
And were still built on floodplains, as we've seen in the past week. I mean, it would have been state-driven. The state would have decided where we want to build the houses, not the developer applying because he had got a field.
Did Judge Kenny talk about local authority housing at all? I remember just seeing a statistic, I think between 1948 and 1970, there was something like 60 to 70,000 local authority houses built all over the country, which is a huge, huge amount of property. And we see all the estates around. I'm reminded of the line from Brendan Behan when he had to move from the North Inner City out to Crumlin. He said, "There's no such thing as suburbia, it's only Siberia." That was his famous line. But there was a huge amount of building of local authority houses. Was that in Judge Kenny's thinking that the state should build them themselves? Yes, it was about getting land. He didn't talk about the process of building at all.
No, I think one of the arguments used against Kenny, he didn't go into detail on social housing or whatever. But, I mean, there's no reason why when the land is acquired, the state couldn't have built on it, the local authority couldn't have built on it themselves. I mean, once the land was acquired this was where it was going to be built, Judge Kenny didn't say who should build it. I mean, it could be private developers, it could be the state, anybody could build on it. I mean, he didn't specifically, I mean, I suppose he couldn't go into everything. He didn't go into great detail on social housing in it.
Another thing that struck me, an interesting tidbit in your book, is that it wasn't just the British government report, it was the report. He was also influenced by a papal encyclical called Pacem Terris, which was released by, or I don't know if release is the word, by Pope John the 23rd just before his death. And that was a very influential part of the Kenny report.
Yeah, because arising from that was the case that Judge Kenny had sat on, which was the case known, the Ryan report case, where very, very briefly, a housewife brought a case when the fluoridization of water came in, that her children shouldn't have to use this water because it'd be bad for their teeth. They were entitled to have the water as it is. And she brought a case against Dublin Corporation, as it was at the time. And we had all sorts of heavyweight barristers arguing on both sides. And the judge in the case was Judge Kenny. And in his judgment, he rejected almost all of her arguments, except he came up with the one critical line that there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution. In other words, specific rights that are not mentioned. And this opened up a whole can of worms. What rights?
Absolutely huge statement in the history of Irish law.
And of course, it was appealed to the Supreme Court. And lo and behold, the Supreme Court came down in favour of Kenny. And the judge that gave the judgment there was Carol O'Dowd, who was later President of Ireland.
Okay, so Tim, you're saying to me now, having gone through this and having studied, and the book is fantastic, it really is fantastic, and it is so relevant today. Your view is, and I think you strongly advocate, that the Kenny report remains evergreen, and it is still relevant today. So, I mean, can we send Darragh O'Brien or whoever is the future housing minister to go into RTE, into those dusty archives, and see if they can root out a copy of this and have a look? You think that is to society's advantage?
I think it's still relevant, not so much maybe to agricultural land anymore, because we were dealing maybe much now with brownfield sites and stuff, but I can see no reason why the principles of Kenny can't be applied to brownfield sites or to any other site, and greenfield sites. I mean, there's no reason why the local authority couldn't still have the same powers as Judge Kenny proposed, and we don't need a referendum in the Constitution to bring it in, which is what he ensured.
I think unfortunately we're getting to the stage where we need to ask the key question we ask of all our guests. Would you want to?
Absolutely. Tim, I don't know whether you're familiar with our feature here where we ask you to recommend a book to our listeners. It can have a legal theme, but we can go beyond the legal theme as well. Anything occur to you at all?
Well, let me mention Rowan McCormack's book, if you want a legal book, on the Supreme Court, which is an excellent piece of of writing, that was done now. The editor of the Irish Times, still relevant, still recommended to anybody who has an interest in law or whatever. For fiction and for what I like to relax and get away from everything, a big heroine writer of mine is Claire Keegan, who's best known for writing Foster, which was the book behind Colleen Kuhn.
The God of Small Things, I think, was that?
She's a book out called Some Small Things Like These.
Okay, sorry.
And she's a new one out called Too Late in the Day. Sorry, I meant to bring with me. A very short book, but very well written. I recommend her for great style of writing, very precise. And
she was nominated for the Booker Prize last year, was shortlisted and was a favourite, but didn't win in the end. Okay,
those two recent books by Claire Keegan.
And Tim, we had a little bit of chit-chat before we were put on the recording device and started talking here. And we were reminiscing about your book on the great PJ Mara, legendary Irish character. And you were saying that you might develop something down the line in terms of political spin, etc. Yeah. Like you're the master, you've been involved over the years with all of that sort of stuff. Yeah. So what's on the horizon for you going forward?
Well, I'm looking at the reason PJ Mara was probably the original, what we call Spin Doctor, who was the press officer for PJ Mara. And some years ago, I went back to my old alma mater, UCC, and I did an MCom on, the thesis was on spin doctoring. And I have a thesis there, and I'd like to turn it into a book on the kind of the spin doctoring and how it works. And again, the relevance today and pointing out examples of it. And maybe it's a synopsis again of the PJ Mara book and how he started it all.
We never get tired hearing about PJ Mara.
And it should be mentioned that you have started your own company, Grand Canal Media, which is specifically to assist people who want to write books of should we say, a medium-run nature that mightn't necessarily go into the front of the big bookshops, but nonetheless would have a reasonable readership.
Yeah, lots of people will write books that might have a few hundred, few thousand sales. Publishers don't want to know them. It's a costly exercise, whatever. I'm hoping that, with digital printing and all the rest of it, we can make it available through Grand Canal Media at a reasonable price with a few bob for the writer.
That's absolutely fantastic.
grandcanalmedia.ie. And again, if I can recommend to any listeners, get a copy of Housing a Missed Opportunity, which will be available online anyway from Grand Canal Media. And it really is, for a very dry subject, a very good read. Thanks very much.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can we say a huge thank you to our guest, Tim Ryan, for coming in and talking to us about the missed opportunity that was the Kenny Report. But Mark, it's never too late. He seems to think it's very much an evergreen document that's very relevant to the housing problems and crisis of today.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about it is that almost all development in Ireland seems to have been market-led, in the sense that it's been developers have identified where they want to develop and they simply apply for zoning or they apply for planning permission. And whereas the nature of the Kenny Report is not just the issue of the 25% surcharge on top of the agricultural value.
Yes.
It's much more an issue of the state effectively identifying where they want to develop, buying the land, and then identifying how it's going to be developed.
Yeah.
And I think
this is a very important book.
Yeah.
And Tim himself, big shout out to Tim, setting up that publishing company where he's going to give people like himself an opportunity to publish books that are so in the public interest but mightn't get another commercial publisher.
Yeah.
I love it. Well done to him. Okay, before we go, can we say a big thank you also to our producer, Conal O'Morine, for his great assistance in putting this podcast together, and to the great Lee Brennan of the Dublin South Podcast Studios for their wonderful work in recording this show. So that's all from us. So from me, Peter Leonard.
And myself, Mark Tottenham.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in the Fifth Court.